would it be prepared to write it into a climate change treaty? Just as developed countries would sign up to emission reduction targets, would China sign up to an intensity target, essentially a commitment to introduce policies with the aim of halving emissions density by around 2020? If China introduces a policy target into its next 5-year plan, but insists that this is only a domestic matter and resists giving it legal international standing, then it won't take us very far. Because from the US perspective in particular, when they come to taking the treaty to the Senate, if there is a new Copenhagen Treaty, it will again look as if the US is binding itself, but that China isn't. And so a treaty, even if agreed, would have bleak prospects for ratification by the US. So Chinese policy needs to have some international recognition. The US, and indeed not just the US, the world needs to be able to say that China is also bound, committed in some way to reduce emissions. So will China be prepared to take that step of international recognition? Well, we don't really know, at least I don't know. The target would be non-binding in the sense that there wouldn't be a penalty for not achieving it. So it wouldn't be very costly for China to sign up. But it would open China up to some sort of international monitoring regime, and it would be seen as a step along the road to China taking on binding targets at some stage, perhaps in 2015 or 2020, so it wouldn't be costless either. It really comes down to whether China wants a global agreement on climate change and sees that in its interests. China can demand more from developed countries. As it's doing, it can demand steeper reduction targets and more international funding. But ultimately, China has to be prepared to give something as well if it wants to see an agreement. So the optimistic case for a Copenhagen deal is that developed countries agree to do more. They get their emission reduction, say, up to 20% from 1990. And they put more public funding on the table. And as I mentioned, there are signs that this is happening. And then developing countries say, okay, well, it's not 40%, but it's a 20% reduction. There's funding for mitigation abroad. And then China puts forward a policy commitment, gives it some sort of international, or shows its willingness to give it some sort of international status. Other key developing countries follow suit, and then you have your agreement. So that, for me, is the optimistic scenario. There are, of course, several pessimistic scenarios. The first is that we get an agreement, but not this year, not at Copenhagen. That, to my mind, is quite likely and not that problematic. We've got till 2012 to reach this agreement, really. But a second and worse scenario is that the two sides are just unable to think that either is getting enough from the other. And so there's no agreement, or if there is an agreement, it's then not ratified by the US Senate, and we continue to lack an effective international framework. Well, if you work on climate change, you have to be an optimist, and even to this downside, there's an upside. And that is, even if we don't have an international agreement, we do see the spread of domestic mitigation around the world. It is very significant now that we have the two major superpowers increasingly embarking on an agenda of domestic mitigation. So even if this isn't enough to translate into an international treaty, it's certainly a positive development from the point of view of climate change. That's the good news, and that will be my message for Australia. We should get off this idea of waiting for Copenhagen and get on with it, in particular, pass our domestic emissions trading legislation. All that said, Australia's own experience and our endless hesitation in actually taking action on climate change makes the case clearly for why the world still does need an international agreement. Domestic action across countries isn't enough. We will see more domestic action with an international treaty than without. China can't engineer an international treaty on its own. Developed countries need to reciprocate. But in my view, China does hold the key. And while overall the prospects for an agreement don't look great, there are reasons to hope that China might use that key and rescue the currently floundering global climate change negotiations. Thank you.